Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're on a mission that's less about just understanding a therapeutic method and more about, well, about how we fundamentally construct our own lives.
That's right.
We are diving deep into narrative therapy, or NT.
And this is so important to frame correctly from the start, because if you've done any reading on mental health approaches, you know the usual players.
Right, you've got the very practical, structure-driven focus of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Or the deep, introspective work of psychoanalysis, or even the warmth of person-centered therapy. Narrative therapy is a total outlier. It's not just a tweak to those existing models. It is a complete philosophical reset.
It sounds like it fundamentally changes the relationship between you and your problems.
It does.
We spent a lot of time unpacking our sources on this, and they laid out NT's really radical theoretical roots, its mechanisms, and how it's actually applied.
And there's a core idea we want you to hold on to through this whole deep dive. Narrative therapy starts with a simple premise. Every single human being is inherently a narrator.
An author.
An author of their own life. And that authorship is active. You are constantly, right now, structuring your past, your present, and your projection of the future through stories.
These internal narratives that you might not even realize you're telling yourself?
Exactly. And this is the key. These stories are not passive reports. They're powerful architects.
They don't just describe your life.
No, they exert this massive defining influence back over the life of the narrator. I mean, if your story says you are defeated, you live defeated. It's that direct.
Okay, so that's the tension we need to resolve here. If these stories are so powerful, where do they get that power?
The sources point us straight to the philosophical foundation that gives NT all its flexibility.
And that is postmodernism.
Right, and I know that sounds academic, but the idea is actually pretty simple and pretty dramatic.
Okay, break it down.
Postmodern philosophy basically argues that we can't access absolute capital-truth. Not directly.
Our access to reality is, what, filtered?
Fundamentally constrained. We only perceive reality through the filters of our minds, our culture, and all these intermediate representations, like language itself.
So if we can only ever access representations of reality, that means ultimate reality, as far as we can know it, isn't singular. It's not fixed.
Precisely. It's a concept the sources call a multiple reality. Or I think a better word is a pluriverse.
I like that. A pluriverse.
Think about it like this. The physical territory of the world is fixed, right? But the maps we draw of it are infinite.
A subway map, a weather map, a political map.
Exactly. And each map is a totally valid representation for a specific purpose. We live in the world of maps, not the territory itself.
And history kind of proves this out, right? I mean, knowledge that was held as absolute truth in physics, in medicine, it's been continuously replaced.
Devalued and supplanted by new methods, new maps, and this process just keeps going. It's fluid.
So if we're all trapped in this world of representation, if every map is temporary, how do we make sense of anything at all?
And that is where narrative steps in.
Okay.
If reality is only accessible through representation, then storytelling the narrative becomes the vehicle that gives meaning to those representations.
So building the map is a narrative process.
Every field, from history to art to science, uses a narrative process to assess value and create meaning. So the mission of this deep dive is to understand how that process of storytelling becomes the actual vehicle for therapeutic change.
It's not about finding the right map.
It's about learning how to draw a new, more useful map.
So let's start with the fundamental nature of that process, how we actually think. It's fascinating because while narrative therapy as a formal thing gets its influence from literature.
Right, from novels and stories.
The sources immediately clarify that the act of narration itself is just. It's a completely natural, often unconscious, daily human behavior.
Absolutely. Narration is innate. It's how we organize the chaos of experience. We tell a story about it to make it make sense.
And literature, as some scholars noted back in the 90s, just came later to formalize it.
It imitates life. It doesn't invent the process. We don't need literature to tell us that we narrate our lives. We just need to listen to our own internal monologue for 5 minutes.
And since we've established we only access reality through these representations, and that every truth is up for revision, we need a way to prioritize what's useful.
We do. And this is where the work of Jerome Bruner in the 80s becomes absolutely essential for understanding NT. He laid out 2 basic modes of human thought.
The 2 ways of processing the world.
2 powerful, very distinct modes. The first one, and this is the foundation of NT, is what he called narrative thinking.
And what makes this mode credible? It's not about objective proof.
No, it creates its credibility through lifelikeness.
Lifelikeness. So
Yeah.
how real it feels.
Correct. The success of a narrative is measured by its authenticity, how much the story feels truthful, resonant, and real from the listener's perspective. It uses drama, imagination, and verifiable history.
To weave together the big abstract themes of humanity, loss, love, conflict.
Right, with concrete, specific spatiotemporal experiences. It grounds the universal in a specific time and a specific place.
Okay, I think we need to slow down on that spatiotemporal idea. That's
Yeah.
academic language for something really profound. What does that grounding actually mean?
It means it matters when and where something happened. If you just talk about sadness, it's an abstract concept.
Right.
But if you talk about the feeling of despair I had at 3 p.m. on Tuesday, standing in my kitchen when the rain started hitting the window, that's spatiotemporal. It's anchored.
It's real. It has a location.
Narrative thinking keeps knowledge tied to the emotional, concrete reality of the person.
And in contrast to that, we have the second mode of thought.
Propositional thinking.
This is the world of pure science.
It is. Propositional thinking creates credibility through empirical proof, through objective verification. Its entire goal is to reduce all that messy, raw, contextual data into abstract information.
So you can link it with other abstract forms and find universal laws.
Exactly. And the practical result of that is that it purposely moves further and further away from that concrete, messy, immediate human experience,
It strips the data away.
leading to complex, abstract conclusions like mathematical equations or scientific laws. The contrast is the whole point. Narrative thinking integrates the universal with the specific human experience.
While propositional thinking strips away the specific to find the objective, abstract law.
And you see this everywhere. The medical model, for example, largely operates in that propositional mode. It's seeking the abstract cause, the chemical imbalance, to treat the specific symptom, the feeling of sadness.
But NT is completely rooted in narrative thinking.
It's seeking the meaning of the sadness within the specific context of that person's kitchen, their Tuesday, their life story.
So if narrative therapy is rooted in this idea that stories create our meaning, that focus immediately puts language under a microscope. And this brings us to section 2, where the sources make a pretty revolutionary claim.
They do. They say language isn't just a vehicle for meaning.
It's more than that.
Language constructs human life. And that is a huge shift in perspective. If you accept that we don't exist outside the frame of language, then language is literally essential for how we understand not just our current reality.
But also our future possibilities.
Yes.
I mean, just think about that for a second. You, the listener, you can't even begin to conceptualize a different future, a new job, a new relationship, without first having the words to describe it.
Language gives the abstract possibility a form, which is why, in NT, the therapist and the client have to pay almost forensic attention to the words being used.
You're not just listening to the content.
You're analyzing how the language itself is framing the client's experiences, their relationships, their whole world. Because narrative serves as this mental scheme that we all use to assign subjective meaning to our experiences over time.
It's the framework. It defines the trajectory, a life's purpose, and it links all those daily disconnected events into these cohesive, episodic units.
That's the subjective knowledge we build. We use our understanding of the past to plan for the future.
And this resulting knowledge, it has a name.
It does. It's called local knowledge. And it's deeply personal, derived from those immediate, concrete experiences.
It might not be objective, capital T truth.
But it holds absolute psychological truth for the person who lived it. It's knowledge built from the ground up, totally specific to that one unique life story.
And this is where the therapeutic leverage really exists, the constructive potential of emplotment. This is arguably the most vital concept in the whole structure.
Emplotment is simply the process of building a plot. It's the intentional, selective arrangement and connection of events to create a coherent structure and ultimately a meaning.
And crucially, it's not about being perfectly chronological.
Not at all. In fact, chronology can be shifted, rearranged, or compressed if it serves the theme you're building.
Yeah, the sources are really firm on this, the flaw of raw chronology.
Yeah.
If you just tell someone every single thing that happened to you in the order it happened without any selection,
It just feels pointless or absurd.
you're just reciting facts. You're not creating meaning. Emplotment is what lifts experience out of that meaninglessness.
And the engine that drives that coherence is the theme. The primary theme, be it resilience, betrayal, survival, or failure, is what guides the selection of which events matter and how they should be connected.
Let's use that detective analogy from the sources. It makes the relationship between an event and a plot so clear.
Okay, so an event is just a recorded occurrence. It's a clue found at the crime scene.
And the plot is the eventual resolution, the deeper meaning that's unveiled after all the evidence is in.
Right. As one source noted, you don't really understand the event until you understand the plot it belongs to.
So the meaning of any specific event is entirely dependent on its logical relationship with that final plot.
A spilled cup of coffee is just an accident, unless the plot is revealed to be a secret poisoning attempt.
Then the spill becomes critical evidence.
And scholars describe this as a principle of best fit. The event and the plot mutually inform each other. They have to fit together.
But stories are dynamic. They unfold over time. So what happens in the middle, when the plot isn't complete? How does the detective or the narrator decide what to look for next?
The event still interacts with the evolving theme. The theme acts as this dynamic guide. It selects events that seem to fit, it discards ones that don't.
And most importantly, it leads to hypotheses for new, missing events.
Exactly. If your theme is, I am perpetually unlucky, you will actively search for and find evidence of failure, and you'll ignore all the successes.
But if your theme shifts to, I am resilient,
You'll start searching your own history for those tiny moments of successful coping that you previously just dismissed as nothing.
this flexibility is the therapeutic leverage. It means the importance of the theme and the meaning of the plot are constantly shifting based on newly discovered events or changes in the surrounding context.
The social context, the cultural context.
Right. And the sources stress this inherent incompleteness. Life goes on, time continues, so the plot can never achieve some full, fixed, permanent state.
And that lack of fixity means that even the most deeply painful, problem-saturated stories that have defined a client for decades can be renegotiated. They can be reauthored. They can be changed.
The past isn't fixed.
The meaning of the past is flexible.
That idea that the meaning of the past is flexible forces us to look at Section 3, which deals with metaphor. Because if we only access reality through representation, we have to understand it through things other than itself.
Which means our entire foundation of thought is fundamentally metaphorical.
And this is where NT really aligns with broader cognitive science. I mean, thinkers like Lakoff argued this back in the 80s. Metaphor is not just for poets.
No, our entire conceptual system, how we think, how we plan, how we act, it relies on metaphor, and most of the time, we don't even know it.
We don't just use metaphors in language.
You think through
We talk about arguments as if they're war. He shot down my points. She attacked my position.
We talk about relationships as if they're a journey. We've hit a roadblock, or we're moving in different directions. We don't realize these are metaphors guiding our actions.
And since communication requires that same cognitive method, if you analyze a client's language, you can see this underlying metaphorical system.
This whole process of using metaphor to create meaning is so central that it's broadly categorized as a process of narrative.
So to structure this worldview, the sources point to these fundamental organizing frames called root metaphors.
Right. And these metaphors clarify our understanding, but as you said earlier, they also set some severe limits. The metaphor you choose to see a problem through determines the method you'll choose to solve it.
Let's focus on the most relevant ones for NT. First, there's mechanism.
This is the machine view. It views the world in terms of cause and effect.
So if I view a client's sadness through the mechanism metaphor, I'm looking for the scientific cause, the machine failure.
And you try to repair that mechanism, usually with a chemical intervention or some kind of physical correction. This is the medical scientific paradigm at its most influential.
The second relevant one, and the one narrative therapy actually uses, is contextualism.
Right. Contextualism demands that you view events only in relation to their full, sprawling historical and environmental context. The meaning isn't fixed in the event itself.
It's derived from the combination of the event, the text, and everything surrounding it, the context.
So NT uses narrative, like history or fiction, to find meaning through this metaphor of text and context.
You also mentioned a third one, formism, which is also really relevant to clinical models.
Yes, formism views the world based on shape, size, or categories. This is the diagnostic approach.
A doctor uses formism when they see a cluster of symptoms, compare that pattern to a set of diagnostic categories in the DSM, and then assign a name of form to the condition.
So if a client presents with severe mood issues, a mechanist looks for a faulty gear or a chemical imbalance.
A formist looks for a category name, like major depressive disorder,
But the contextualist therapist uses narrative to find meaning by viewing those same events through the lens of history, relationship, and environment.
The difference in the intervention that follows must be enormous.
It is. And this brings us to this profound NT stance on diagnosis,
Right.
the distinction between seeing as versus being as.
And this is often the point that gets the most pushback, I think, because it seems to challenge the objectivity of science.
It does, but in a very subtle way. From the NT perspective, when a client is diagnosed with a condition that requires medication, that disorder isn't necessarily only explainable through neuroscience. It is currently being viewed through a metaphor or a stance of seeing as neuroscience.
So it's a valid and powerful representation of reality, but it's still just a representation.
Right. Now, wait, I have to challenge that on behalf of the listener. If someone has schizophrenia, they have a biological reality, a chemical imbalance, or some structural brain difference. Isn't saying that's just a metaphor, kind of dismissing the objective science.
That's a great question.
And the answer is not at all. NT isn't dismissing the existence of the biological process or the utility of medication. It's just stating that the explanation we get from neuroscience is based on that mechanistic root metaphor.
So the moment you acknowledge it as seeing as neuroscience.
It becomes flexible. And this flexible view allows you to choose other metaphors, other ways of seeing the problem, to explain and resolve issues alongside, or even instead of relying solely on that fixed biological cause.
So the disorder is biological, but the meaning and the explanation we assign to it don't have to be solely biological.
Exactly. And you contrast this with the non-flexible viewpoint, which adheres to being as.
Which believes in a singular, unchanging reality.
That the disorder is the chemical imbalance, full stop, and all meaning flows from that biological fact.
Yeah.
The NT approach is an acknowledgement that human problems, especially emotional and relational ones, are simply too complex to be fully contained by just one metaphor.
You choose the most useful way to see the problem for the purpose of moving forward.
That's it.
That realization, that reality is multi-storied, is the key philosophical move that enables everything in Section 4. The core mechanics of narrative therapy.
It is. If we accept this idea of multiple realities, then life must be viewed as having multiple possible narratives, a multi-storied version of life.
It's the essential antidote to the dead-end story.
Exactly. If you only believe in one fixed story about yourself, rigid problem views are basically unavoidable. But if you have a multi-storied version, the client and the therapist are always seeking new meanings, new themes, and new reautherings.
So the problem isn't eliminated.
Its power is diminished because other, stronger stories now exist.
But the sources stress a really crucial point here. The new story can't be arbitrary, and it definitely can't be the therapist's preferred meaning.
No, this is about therapeutic integrity. The new narrative has to be grounded deeply in the client's own values and their own social context.
The therapist's role is process-based.
They guide the client through the process of discovery, making sure the resulting meaning is authentic and useful in the client's actual life, with their family and cultural norms, not just in the therapy room.
The journey begins with the initial state, the problem-saturated description. This is the client's entry ticket, usually filled with suffering and shame.
And the therapist first honors that story. Michael White, one of the founders of NT, redefined this as a thin description.
Thin because it only covers a partial meaning of life.
It only tells one part of the truth. It overlooks all the counter-evidence, ignores other possibilities, and that's what leads the client to feel stuck. It's a dead end. The goal is to thicken the story.
So the first concrete step is often just naming the problem.
Giving the problem a name, the worry, the shame monster, family trouble, clarifies its scope. It's like creating a character in the narrative.
And that act of external naming gives the client an immediate, crucial sense of control.
Right. And the name should always ideally come from the client, though it can evolve. For example, chronic rage might eventually become the fight for recognition.
And that leads directly into the signature NT technique, the one that really defines the whole approach, using externalizing language.
This is the therapeutic magic trick. The language is used to implicitly but very powerfully suggest that the client is affected by the problem, but they are not the problem itself.
It's a fundamental separation of identity.
It is.
So instead of saying, you are depressed, or why did you make that sad decision, the language is shifted.
Just something like, when did depression first creep into your life and start influencing your decisions?
The shift is profound. It moves the client from being intrinsically flawed to being a resilient individual who is currently struggling with an external entity.
They go from being the problem to being someone fighting the problem. And that immediately fosters self-esteem and resilience because their identity is no longer defined by the life-stalling issue.
I think we need a few more concrete examples here because it sounds deceptively simple. How does this technique deal with problems that feel so personal, like anxiety or self-loathing?
Okay, let's take self-loathing. Instead of, tell me about your low self-esteem, the therapist might ask, how long has the critic been whispering instructions to you, and what are the specific rules that the critic insists you must follow?
So you give the internal voice agency, separate from the person.
Exactly. This lets the client observe the process of self-loathing rather than being immersed in the feeling. It turns an internal state into an external object they can examine and challenge.
And this technique is also essential for exploring the impact of social and political issues, which NT explicitly includes in its framework.
Absolutely. NT recognizes this self is constructed by social reaction. Externalizing helps to examine how oppression or systemic racism or unfair workplace dynamics are contributing factors.
So instead of internalizing failure and thinking, I'm not good enough,
Externalizing helps them see the invisibility cloak of inequality has been actively diminishing my achievements.
and the application differs a lot, depending on the client's role. For victims of abuse, externalizing decentralizes the cause from their own self, which combats internalized shame.
And for someone struggling with destructive behavior toward others, you externalize the ideology behind the behavior, the negative belief system.
Like asking an abuser, how long has the thought, my pain justifies controlling others, been dictating your choices?
Right. The goal is to make that ideological commitment visible so the client can critique it, rather than letting them hide behind simple behavioral descriptions. You always want to decenter the cause of the problem from the client's core identity.
Once that separation is achieved, the therapist moves into relative influence questioning.
This means exploring two sides at the same time. Side one is the easy, problem-saturated side. How has the problem impacted the client's life?
And side two is the revolutionary side.
How has the client managed or impacted the life of the problem? The therapist asks for specific instances where the client successfully resisted the problem.
This is the search for unique outcomes.
These are the small, often dismissed or forgotten experiences of successful coping that fundamentally contradict the dominant problem-saturated story.
So the problem story says, you are anxious and can never speak in public.
And a unique outcome might be, but I managed to order coffee at that new cafe yesterday without shaking. The therapist has to patiently listen to the full problem narrative first, let the client exhaust it, before gently guiding them to these tiny, often undervalued moments of success.
And just finding them isn't enough. You have to move to the deconstruction of unique outcomes. You have to magnify them and give them significance.
Yes, this involves linking that unique outcome, that moment of success, to the client's broader context, their family history, their social world, their past, their future. The core question is always, why did this specific moment of success contradict the old problem story?
By amplifying the story around that successful moment, you weaken the meaning of the original problem story.
That is the process of problem deconstruction.
So the meaning of ordering coffee successfully isn't just I ordered coffee. It becomes that moment of success proved I still possess the resilience inherited from my grandmother, which the anxiety monster had temporarily suppressed.
Precisely. You are literally rewriting the history of the self. And once the client has a richer, broader narrative, a thicker description, they're invited to take a position.
This is the moment of choice.
The client chooses their new stance. Will they fully embrace this new, broader narrative? Do they need to seek more evidence to confirm it? Or, and this is crucial, will they choose to stay in the painful old story?
Because sometimes the change is just too scary.
It can be. Exploring the potential results of either choice together, what happens if you stay the same versus what happens if you change, is a form of immunity building. It prepares the client for the world outside the therapy room where those old problem narratives still exist.
And to support this huge reauthoring process, NT uses some really powerful practical techniques. Let's start with the supporting documents.
Therapeutic documents are essential because they give the whole ephemeral process a physical anchor. These can be notes, letters, audio recordings, or summaries written by the client or the therapist.
And they detail findings, progress, lessons learned.
For a client who doubts their own memory, a documented unique outcome becomes objective proof of their own resilience.
Then there's the really emotionally resonant concept of remembering, often called the club of my life.
This is a highly metaphorical and intentional way of building an internal support system. The client is invited to consciously bring memories of important people into their internal club,
It could be a deceased relative, a teacher, a historical figure.
even a helpful stranger. These members serve as supportive influences or role models. The founders of NT recognize that clients often do this when their real-life relationships are too critical or harsh. It creates a curated, reliable resource inside their mind.
It's a way of saying, I'm defined not just by the people who hurt me, but also by the people who believed in me, even if they're not physically here anymore.
Exactly. It broadens the social self beyond the immediate, painful present. And finally, there's the most social technique, outsider witnesses.
This moves the validation of the news story completely outside the client-therapist relationship.
The client shares their newly constructed story with external listeners, other therapists, trusted family, friends, right there in the counseling room. And critically, the witnesses then share their own experiences related to the story.
They don't try to change the client's story.
No, they might say, hearing you talk about your resilience reminded me of the time I had to make a tough choice about my career. They clarify and broaden the narrative without challenging the core meaning the client has created. They are there to affirm, reflect, and enrich the story, not redirect it.
It sounds like a high-stakes ritual designed to solidify the client's new identity in a social context, which is where the identity came from in the first place.
That is the entire point. You are testing the new map against the territory, confirming its utility, and gaining social recognition for the new author you have become.
And therapy concludes, often with a celebratory final session, when the client feels they have a sufficiently rich, multifaceted life story they can confidently use to navigate their future. Let's move into section 5, where we see all these ideas translated from abstract theory into actual therapeutic power through a really detailed case study.
Right, a client recovering from mood disorders.
The process starts, as always, with the therapist's core posture, suspension of assumption.
The therapist has to approach the situation as if they know nothing about the client's life or the cause of their symptoms. They use open-ended questions, deep empathy, and they facilitate the client narrating the story to themselves.
The meaning has to emerge from the client's own context.
It has to.
This focus on process sounds structurally similar to person-centered therapy, where the therapist creates the conditions for the client's own self-discovery.
True, but it diverges sharply from something like psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis interprets unconscious content and guides the client to a rational, objective understanding of their internal world.
Whereas NT is strictly focused on subjective meaning creation through narrative.
Right. Though it's worth noting, the sources do confirm that traditional psychoanalytic insights like recognizing a fragmented self, or the difference between a true and false self, can provide profoundly meaningful content that the client then uses to build their new NT story.
And there's an interesting parallel to cognitive therapy as well.
There is. The act of creating a constructive, positive meaning through narrative in NT often leads naturally to the successful modification of those deeply entrenched, irrational beliefs, but without the direct, sometimes confrontational restructuring that CBT uses.
So let's look at the case study. A 53-year-old woman. She was referred by her doctor because of persistent somatic symptoms.
Headaches, asthma, things that weren't resolving with standard medical treatment.
And her initial presentation was a textbook problem-saturated story. Her physical symptoms started after she moved back home to care for her 82-year-old mother.
And the stress wasn't the physical caregiving, it was this intense emotional manipulation. The mother would feign illness, complain constantly, and tell the neighbors her daughter was neglecting her.
This generated a huge emotional burden for the client. Anger, deep shame, overwhelming guilt, and confusion.
And the core narrative of her life had been set in childhood. The mother overtly favored the sons, treated the daughters harshly, and then excused it by claiming she kept the girls close because she loved them so much.
Which simultaneously forced them into servitude and discouraged their education.
So the therapist used the core NT approach: suspension of assumption, active listening, empathy, investigating the concrete evidence. And the theme shifted from brain problem to relationship problem, and finally settled on sadness and guilt.
The first intervention was immediately externalization.
They agreed to name the issue emotional sadness, creating that separation. The woman was someone fighting the sadness, not someone who was sadness.
And the change was almost immediate. By the second session, they had their first unique outcomes.
Her somatic symptoms had already improved. And why? Partly because she felt accepted by the therapist, which instantly mitigated that acute guilt, And crucially, she reported actively fighting the sadness, even praying for forgiveness. She was taking an active stance.
So the theme began this massive shift away from the story of guilt and sinfulness to forgiveness and acceptance of herself as someone actively challenging a negative perception she inherited from her childhood.
That identity shift from being a sinful person to being a fighter provided the leverage for the reauthoring.
And this is where the therapist, seeing that opening, posed the critical question, the one designed to shatter the old premise.
They asked, "What valuable lesson did you gain from the difficulty of living with your mother since childhood?"
And the client was, understandably, stunned. She wept.
But then she started to realize the truth about her mother's communication style. Her mother would consistently say one thing while wanting another, always manipulating the narrative to preserve her image as a loving martyr.
So what was the resource she discovered?
The daughter realized her survival mechanism was to develop this extreme, finely tuned skill in reading people and anticipating their needs. A skill she had to perfect just to navigate her mother's indirect manipulative world.
That skill, which we might typically label as maladaptive or a sign of codependence, was instantly reframed as a resource.
Exactly. She realized this same survival skill was the direct cause of her successful marriage. She could intuitively manage her quiet husband's emotional needs and her significant business success, which had led to prosperity far greater than that of her siblings.
So a new plot emerges from the old events. The exact same painful childhood experiences are now reauthored, not under the plot of undeserving victim.
But under the plot of success in life and social adaptability. The trauma, though real and emotionally damaging, was the crucible that forged this invaluable adaptive resource.
The therapist then broadened the narrative further, bringing in the necessary context of her siblings.
Right. The Favor brothers, it turned out, had failed financially. They lacked the discipline to manage the assets their mother gave them, and the sister, who remained trapped by the mother's narrative, lived a miserable life and died young.
This context is so vital for deconstructing the client's guilt.
Seeing the full picture, that those who stayed were arguably harmed more, provided massive justification. Her life choices weren't just adaptive, they were a move toward health and success. She had to leave in order to thrive.
And that brought them to the final stage. Outsider witnesses. The client shared her new, rich story with her husband and her daughter.
The husband provided crucial external validation. He affirmed that he had always seen her as loving, resilient, and resourceful.
And the daughter's response was maybe even more profound. She confessed that she had previously worried her mother was unconsciously repeating the grandmother's manipulative patterns.
But hearing the reauthored story, she now saw her mother as a role model of resilience and active change. The new identity was affirmed socially, making sure it wasn't just a pleasant thought inside the therapy room.
Now, we have to address the mother's behavior. The sources noted that the mother actually stopped the overt manipulation. How did NT approach that final ambiguous event?
They explored multiple possibilities. Was it compassion? Did the daughter's sickness and therapy soften her? Or was it malicious satisfaction that the curse of making her daughter care for her had worked?
But the final theme they settled on was rooted in shifting power dynamics.
They confirmed, through concrete evidence from the daughter, that the elderly mother's love was genuine. She worried when her child was sick. But more importantly, the mother was now utterly dependent on the client.
This reversed the power structure of her childhood.
Exactly. The mother's previous manipulative behavior came from a lifetime of learned control. Now, fear and compliance driven by dependence led to her improved behavior. The mother's actions weren't about dominating anymore. They were about survival, and the daughter was now in control of the narrative.
So the client successfully reauthored her identity. She went from being a sinful person trapped in a thin, problem-saturated story to a resourceful, successful, and resilient person with a broad, valuable story.
And the physical symptoms improved. She reduced her medication because the context, the meaning of her life stress had fundamentally changed.
So what does this entire deep dive mean for you, the author of your own life? As we synthesize the value of narrative therapy, its immense success really comes from the fact that the new identity and the new meaning emerge entirely from the client's own social, cultural, and moral values.
Right. The therapist is just the architect of the process that allows this indigenous meaning to surface.
They facilitate self-discovery, they don't impose answers.
And the key distinction here is the approach to resources. NT doesn't dismiss skills that appear maladaptive on the surface. That skillful mind reading the client developed, that indirect communication style would be flagged as something to correct in many therapies.
But NT treated it as a core creative resource.
because it led to genuine success in the client's future life.
That's a huge difference. NT recognizes that in the client's specific, complicated context, that skill was the key to their survival and later success. It honors the adaptive nature of their response, regardless of whether it meets some textbook ideal of communication.
And this is only possible because the therapist and client usually share a common cultural context about what constitutes constructive behavior. We can agree that business success, a happy marriage, and reduced physical symptoms are valuable outcomes.
That shared, unspoken context is the foundation that ensures the meaning creation is safe and useful.
It is.
So if we take a final step back and look at our own lives through this lens, reflecting on the power of metaphor in the stories we tell, we establish that our thoughts, our actions, our very concept of reality are fundamentally built upon those unconscious root metaphors we discussed.
Mechanism, formism, organicism, or contextualism. So here's the final provocative thought for you to carry forward from this.
Okay.
Consider the biggest recurring challenge you are currently facing, the one you keep getting stuck on. What deeply ingrained root metaphor might be unconsciously defining that problem for you?
Are you seeing the problem through the lens of mechanism, constantly searching for the one broken gear to fix? Or are you viewing it through formism, stuck on the label or the category?
And if you chose a new metaphor, specifically the contextualist lens of narrative, what concrete, unique outcome in your own life might offer a constructive alternative story?
Because every life story can be reauthored.